Great, thank you very much. And yeah, I just need to say, distinguished guests, ladies, gentlemen, anyone out there who might be different. And of course, I'm not sure she's here in the room, but the one and only Sanjam. Thank you very, very much for the incredible privilege to be able to come all the way from Australia in order to say to all of you, g'day. So, with no further ado, let's go on an adventure together. So after all, a sea voyage is, by its very legal definition, an adventure. And to do that, I'm going to tell a few stories, beginning with mine. And yes, that's me. Quite a long time ago, all the way back in 1991, I was a young 19-year-old cadet straight out of school who'd run away to sea in search of balloons. Oh, not really. I was chasing adventure. What I found, though, was something very different, because before I'd even joined my first ship, a bosun who looked something like that stopped me on the wharf, introduced himself, and told me his plan was to either break me or kick me over the side. It was not exactly the welcome I'd imagined. You see, at that time, the Australian maritime industry was trialling what I now think of as a kind of social experiment, trying to break down the barriers between officers and crew. And the idea was simple. Every new entrant, cadets, officers, crew, would all start from the same place. The theory was, if we began together, we'd understand each other better. So my first year as a cadet was spent living and working with the crew, with no explanation, no guidance, and no support. The result, the officers ignored me, and the crew treated me as the enemy they still assumed I was one day going to become. It was, to say the very least, brutal. But amongst all that, a few people on board, the catering staff, the second cook in particular, who's still a dear friend of mine, reached out and showed me the kindness I needed to make it through. So while I made it, the cultural experiment failed. And not because it was a bad idea, but because all they did was change the rules and expect us to get along. Nothing was done to build trust, and nothing was done to involve us in shaping the way it might actually work. Okay, so that one failed. Let's fast forward now to 1995 and a cultural experiment that actually did kind of work. I was back at sea aboard our college's training vessel, around in the northwest tip of Tasmania, which is actually where I live, by the way. But, it's also one of the windiest places on Earth. And that night, it was living up to its name. It was the first and only time I've ever been properly seasick on a ship. And look, as an aside, if you are going to be seasick, and I'm not suggesting anyone here actually wants to be seasick, but if it does happen, ice cream and strawberry topping is not a bad last meal. Anyway, the next morning in calmer seas, just 100 miles away from where we'd been, we heard some news. One of my company's ships, the Iron Baron, had run aground. Not because of the bad weather and not because of bad luck, but because of a failure of teamwork and a lack of communication. The ship was unfortunately lost. But out of that disaster came what's now known as bridge resource management. For the first time in Australia, deck officers were trained not just in navigation, but in things like communication, leadership, and error management. I'm sorry if this is lagging behind a little bit. And we're also asked to start thinking about the way people work together, which was really, really new for all of us. We're being taught that leadership isn't always about leading from the front. It's about involving your team to make the most of every situation. And as I said, that cultural change kind of worked. So what was the difference between the social experiment and bridge resource management? Both were industry-led initiatives and both included everyone, but one failed and the other worked. Well, to understand that, we need to understand what culture is. And I do apologise, this doesn't seem to be working terribly well. Anyway, what's culture? Is it a poster on a bulkhead, a slogan, a strategy, a piece of art or music? Well, it is those things, but it's also more. Culture is the sum of our everyday. It lives in the words we choose, the power we share or hold back. It's every silence. It's every laugh and every shrug. And while you can write down an aspirational mission statement, that alone does not create culture. Culture is written every day in the lived stories of the people who make it, and that's why it's so hard to change. Changing culture means asking everyone to start telling a new story together. But here's the chicken and egg of culture change. People won't pick up a pen to start writing a new story unless they trust that their words will truly count. And if people don't feel as though they're involved, they're not going to trust that their words will count. And nothing will ever change. Trust and involvement feed each other, and you'll never achieve a change of culture if you don't have both. There's another mistake that's very easy to make. We often think things like a safe culture come from compliance, from rules, from checklists and enforcement. And while it's true that compliance may set a standard for safety, that standard will not of its own accord create a safe culture. To create a safe culture, you need involvement. Because when people are involved, they know they have a choice to step in, step up, or stop whatever it is that's about to go wrong. And that's why BRM worked. Not because it gave us another rule book, but because it taught us that people are involved, or when people are involved, they have that choice, and they work better together. So for those of us who were able to create that safe space of involvement on our own, it was transformational. But for those who weren't able to do that, it still missed the mark. Because the thing BRM didn't teach us was how to build trust in the first place. And that brings me to another story I need to tell. And I'm sorry that this one comes with a bit of a trigger warning. Thank you. So if you could just bear with me, I'll try and flick through this and we'll catch up. You see, this was going to be amazing. Okay, and I am sorry about this. A few years ago, near the port I worked in, a young cadet went missing. Days later, their body was found washed up on the shore. This ship was in the inner anchorage, so they weren't very far from the shore. All that was known at the time was that they disappeared one night and no one had seen it happen. Having lived through my own early days at sea, being made to feel useless, isolated, and treated as an enemy, I can imagine some of the weight they might have been carrying. And it makes me wonder, what was the difference between their story and mine? Why am I standing here today and not them? And I can't know for sure, but maybe the difference was this. As I said earlier, on my first ship, a few people chose to care. They showed kindness. And that gave me just enough reason to stay. And care, well, I think there's a bit of a lesson there for all of us. Because care is the thing that BRM didn't actually teach us. Because while involvement depends on trust, trust itself rests on three essential ingredients: integrity, doing what you say you'll do, competence, being able to do what you say you'll do, and care. You need to care not just about what you're doing, but about who you are doing it with. Because when people feel cared about, they feel safe to choose involvement. And that's what makes a culture safe. BRM showed us the power of involvement. But without these three ingredients of trust, involvement couldn't take shape. And what does that look like? Well, let's revisit my first story and that attempted culture change. I was on a ship where everyone looked like me. We were all white, Australian, males. But there was no trust, no involvement, and very little care. Let's take that a step further now. If a shipload of men who all look the same can fail so badly, imagine what might happen if you combine those same conditions with differences that are even more visible. Gender, nationality, ethnicity, sexuality, generation. Too many people around the world have found themselves excluded not just because they were going to become an officer, but because they looked a little bit different. I survived, and I'm here today to tell the tale. But for every story like mine, how many don't we hear? How many choose to walk away because they're discriminated against, bullied, harassed, or worse? And that's a truth we have to face. A poor culture doesn't just make life hard. It can end careers and lead to disasters. But by the same token, the right culture can save lives. And that culture is built on care, trust, and involvement. The interesting thing about this is it's not just a recipe for repairing something that might be wrong. It's a recipe that can also help make a good culture even better. Because when care is shown, it builds trust, and people can choose to step in and involve themselves, and that leads to more trust. And that can lead to what we like to call high trust teams. And I can tell you from personal experience, watching that take shape in a group of people is absolutely beautiful. It's amazing. And that's the kind of work that myself and my colleagues like to do. High trust teams learn faster, adapt better, and speak up sooner. And they don't just survive tough moments, they grow stronger through them. Because they know that when more people are involved, more people are able to give more answers when you need them the most. And those are the teams that have the safety and resilience our industry depends on. And that is the full circle of my stories. Because every day across ships, ports, offices, people are writing and rewriting the story of our industry. And they deserve more than just rules. They deserve care. They deserve trust. They deserve involvement. And that means they deserve workplaces where difference is seen as a strength to steer by. Because diversity, in all its shapes and colours, isn't just an add-on to trust. It's the keel that will keep our fleets balanced and floating into the future. Embracing our differences isn't a challenge we need to face. It's the answer to the challenges our industry is facing. And the way to make the most of that is through involvement. So, I'll leave you with this. Which story do you want to help write? One that's written after something's gone wrong? Or one that begins something like this? Let's go on an adventure together. An adventure of involvement that builds cultures where every cadet and seafarer, every superintendent and administrative officer, every broker and freight forwarder, every maritime SheEO is safe to work, safe to grow, and safe to thrive. Because that story is still ours to write. Thank you.